This is Duke University.
This week on Office Hours, some think budget cuts in the newsroom and the rise of digital journalism will cause the demise of investigative reporting. But Duke professor Sarah Cohen thinks some technology can facilitate watchdog journalism. In her career as a journalist, Cohen won several awards, including a Pulitzer Prize while at the Washington Post. At Duke, Cohen is a professor of journalism and public policy at the Sanford School and director of the Reporters Lab at the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. The lab's goal, Cohen says, is to arm reporters with tools that reduce the cost and difficulty of reporting on stories of public interest. Cohen joins us today to take your questions on the changing methods of journalism.
Welcome to Office Hours. I'm Sarah Krueger, a Duke senior and a production assistant at the show. Joining me today is Sarah Cohen, the Knight Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So today, looking at the newspapers, it's evident that the Trayvon Martin case is still dominant in the media landscape. So how do you see the role of investigative journalists in this case?
I think this is one of those cases where looking at the law itself rather than the individual case is where I think investigative reporters could really make a difference. The Stand Your Ground law has been in, I think, 12 states or 21 states since it was passed in Florida, and looking at the results of that law would be the kind of thing that you would want to do as an investigative reporter, that the individual case may or may not turn out to be what it seems, but the law itself might encourage some behavior that is a surprise.
Mm-hmm. And so I know you in the context as my journalism ethics professor, but there's another facet to your Duke involvement, which is the Reporters Lab. So would you mind talking a little bit about that lab and what its mission is?
Sure. When I came to Duke, one of the things that we talked about a lot was this idea of computational journalism, and I think that evokes an image of story by robot or something like it. And what we were trying to do at the Reporters Lab is almost the opposite of that. What we're really interested in is the idea that technology has profoundly changed virtually every part of everybody's lives, from Twitter and the way that we get news to all the different outlets for news. But the one thing that hasn't changed very much in the last 15 years is the way we collect the news. And so one of the things that we're really interested in doing is seeing how we can bring to bear more technology in order to reduce the effort that it takes to get to a story. A couple of examples might be easier to think about. As an example, there's one tool that's really useful for a lot of reporters now called Document Cloud, which takes your scanned documents and lets you annotate them and find all the names of people. It really speeds up your ability to go through a large document dump. That's the kind of thing that would take hours and hours for a reporter to go through page by page, that it can actually speed up the process and take away some of the tedium of a lot of this kind of work, because investigative reporting is tedious at best.
And is the Document Cloud something that your lab developed? Or?
No, we haven't done that here. That was developed through a Knight Challenge grant a couple of years ago, and it's now housed at Investigative Reporters and Editors. But it's the kind of thing that we're interested in. We're trying to develop in our lab a video and audio equivalent to Document Cloud, where you can annotate and use your Twitter stream to navigate audio public records that are on audio and video. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to develop.
I'm not sure if this is confidential, but would you mind telling us a little bit more about the projects your lab is currently working on?
That's one of them. It's called the Video Notebook. That's one of the projects. We're right now trying to settle in on what the next projects are going to be. But Video Notebook is the one that we're really excited about first, because at this point, most local reporters, particularly local reporters, but some national reporters, have to go to county council meetings, school board meetings, and live tweet the events. It means they can't take notes, and they don't really get to listen to what's going on. So if they can use their own Twitter streams to navigate those videos, they can go back and do better stories. I know as a reporter myself, I've had to listen to 3 and 4 days of city council meetings just to find the place that one person said one thing that I know they said. So anything we can do to reduce the amount of time we spend on audio and video records is really useful.
Right. And I know newsrooms across the country and probably the world are increasingly faced with budget cuts. And has this had a particular impact on investigative reporting?
Yeah, it's had a profound effect on investigative reporting. In some cases, and I know you've got some clips from John Drescher at the News and Observer, newsrooms have decided that that is the one area they want to preserve. And I think that's an area that the News and Observer's worked really hard to preserve. But in other cases, they've really had to slash their investigative budgets. It may mean that they can't take on as ambitious projects as they might have in the past. It may mean that they just cut out their investigative team altogether. And it may mean that stories just have to go with fewer resources. One of the things you really see is that the ability of the media in writ large to fight for public records and to sue governments over their failure to make records public has really been harmed by this latest, by the most recent financial problems.
And what are the broader social implications to cutting down on investigative reporting? Is there any other organization that can pick up the slack?
You know, I think some NGOs can, and some are, actually. There's a group in Washington called the Project on Government Oversight that effectively is an investigative reporting group, but one with a particular mission and a particular point of view. Some NGOs can, but they're, especially at the local and state level, there really aren't there's really no one else whose job it is to watch government and to make government and powerful institutions accountable. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of time and effort to do that. It takes a lot of background. It takes a lot of just attention. And knowing that somebody is watching you makes a big difference about how you're going to act. That's not to say citizens can't do it, mm-hmm. but at what point can you really expect people to take their hobby time and really dig into things? It's just not a reasonable expectation in most cases.
Right. And we'd like to remind our viewers that you can participate in this conversation by tweeting with the hashtag DukeLive, posting to the Duke University Facebook page, or by sending an email to live@duke.edu. And earlier today, we talked with John Drescher, who's the executive editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, and he talked about these kind of budget implications on investigative reporting. So let's take a look at that video now.
For us, the major cost has been personnel costs, and some of our bigger investigative pieces over the last few years, I've kind of done a back of the envelope analysis of what our costs have been, and we do have some travel costs, we clearly have newsprint costs, things like that, but by far our biggest cost is personnel, and it's not unusual at all for us to spend $150,000 or $200,000 on a major investigative series. So this kind of work, it's really public service journalism. It's really important. It's also very expensive. Clearly, as computer analytics become more sophisticated, that can be a really good reporting tool too. You look for academia to kind of be to lead, to be on the cutting edge of things. And analytics is becoming a much bigger industry for everybody, but certainly there's a journalistic application to that.
So in light of that, do you think that digital media can facilitate investigative journalism? And if so, how?
Absolutely. There have been such advances in fields like digital humanities and history and literature studies. Simple things like when a historian learns how to do automatic recognition of handwritten letters that were written by, historical figures, or another project in Europe where they're looking at automatic recognition of handwritten forms from World War I. There's a direct corollary to looking at handwritten police reports that you get from your local police department. So there are so many advances going on in the last 10 or so years in almost every other discipline that we just have not applied to reporting yet. And part of it is that reporting is not quite a discipline. It's still considered a bit of a trade. There's really not a PhD in journalism. There might be one in communications, but not in journalism. And so we kind of have to look to see what other disciplines are doing and figure out how we can adapt them to reporting. But there are absolute great corollaries in other fields.
Mm-hmm. And we've gotten a question from Eric by email, and he asks, while the need for solid investigative reporting is greater than ever, isn't it true that fewer news outlets are equipped to invest in long-range projects due to budget cuts, smaller staffs, etc.? What can small news outlets, like the weekly newspaper or the local TV outlet in a small market, do to stay relevant in terms of investigations?
I think that's an great question, because it is the small local and state level news organizations that are most at risk right now. And it's those exact ones where the need is greatest. I think that we probably have a lot of eyes on our federal government and not so many on our local and state government. So it's a great question. I don't have the answer to the business model. But, you know, I've said this as a joke in the past, and I don't want to sound flip, but the idea that if we spent as much time doing investigations as we do giving a mouthpiece to powerful people and following them around and repeating what they say, we might be able to do a little bit more. And again, I don't want to sound flip about that, but we might be able to change our, to let powerful people speak for themselves, maybe even give them an avenue on your site to say, here's what the government wants you to know, and now I'm going to spend time looking at what they don't want you to know.
Mm-hmm. And something that you've talked about is that pre-online journalism, there was a problem of not having enough information. And now with the technological boom, we have so much information, we almost don't know what to do with it. So how do kind of maybe the less involved people in journalism stay attuned to what's true news and what's not?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem we have right now is we have an explosion in outlets for the exact same news over and over again. So the idea that you're just being exposed to the same story and a tiny little incremental piece of it comes through at every time. And I think some of it's your personality. If you really care about having the latest up-to-date thing, maybe you can just do with your Twitter stream. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of the once-a-day view of news, where I don't really want to know every latest moment of something. I like the idea that somebody can give me a roundup, and so I look for people that I trust to give me a good roundup and who know a lot more than I do. But I do think that I've noticed it in our students here. I think especially in your generation, a lot of people are becoming very brand conscious, that's the way you deal with it, is that you find some trusted brands. The New York Times is a favorite one for many people, Fox News for others, that you look for a trusted brand and you follow that one, and that way you don't have to deal with every explosion.
And what are some of those brands that you trust? Obviously, the Washington Post,
yes,
but any others?
You know, my daily reading is the New York Times and the Washington Post. I actually find Slate a really interesting read a lot of times. Those are the main ones, though. I'm not quite as well informed as I used to be when I was in the newsroom.
And one cause you're very committed to is transparency in government. And in 2011, you testified in front of the Senate and spoke about FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act, ensuring public access to U.S. government records. So we're going to take a look at a video clip of your testimony.
Today I'd like to describe two of the biggest impediments to the effective use of FOIA among journalists, and I detail others in my written statement. But at core, they all suggest a widespread but wrong default position that records belong to the government and not to the public. This position turns FOIA upside down. Instead of the government convincing the public that certain information must be kept secret, in practice the public must convince officials that it should be released.
So you say that there's an assumption that records belong to the government and not to the people. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and why that's problematic?
Yeah, I mean, the underlying concept of a democracy is that we operate it in public. It's very efficient to do things in secret. Lots of dictatorships work in secret, and they work quite efficiently. But the idea of a democracy is that we are allowed to know what the government is doing in our name and with our money. And so the idea that those records are ours is pretty fundamental in a lot of a lot of our democracy. So what happens in practice, though, is that the custodians of those records, and that's what they're legally called, is a custodian, not an owner. The custodians of those records have decided that they're going to dole them out whenever they see fit. And so that perception all of a sudden means that the people in power who have the records are allowed to decide what the public gets to see. And it's just a fundamental issue in a democracy if you can't see what the government is doing.
And we'd like to remind our viewers that you can participate in this conversation by emailing live@duke.edu, tweeting with the hashtag DukeLive, or posting to the Duke University Facebook page. We've just gotten a question in from James, and he asks, what are one or two investigative series besides your own that you really respect?
I think everybody in journalism would say that one of the same ones is that the Walter Reed story at the Washington Post from a few years ago that exposed the crown jewel of the military healthcare system as not quite the crown jewel that we thought it was, is one of the more important stories in the last decade. The other one that I think of as one of the most important stories in the last decade or so is the investigation by the Boston Globe of the Catholic Church and abuse of children through the acceptance of abuse of children in the Catholic Church. Those are the two that I think of as really resonating in a lot of ways.
And looking back now at your investigative series that you've done, is there anything about them that you wish you could go back and change or maybe have done differently?
Well, I think any reporter or journalist feels this way. I cringe when I go back and look at my own stories. I really hate reading them, and I look at them and I'm like, oh man, come on, that really wasn't quite what I meant to do. I don't think there's ever been a series that you got to what you thought you might have been able to get to. The thing that I think sometimes is frustrating is that when you think that you've identified an issue that deserves some attention, that it doesn't always get the attention that you think it should. And that happens more on national stories than local stories. Local stories, it's much easier to affect change, which is really what investigative reporting is all about, is to identify problems and allow officials give them the information they need to make improvements. So, it's really frustrating a lot of times at the national level to do those. Things don't change very much in Congress very easily.
And going back to the idea of government transparency, what do you see the climate like in that realm today, and how has that changed under Obama, if at all?
It is more of an expressed value of the Obama administration to be transparent, but we just haven't seen much difference. And, I'm involved now with several stories where the reluctance to release records is no different than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. We're seeing a couple of things that are very troubling coming out of the administration in terms of open records. But there is kind of an underlying improvement, I would say improvement, underlying change, especially at the local and state level. I think that the open government movement, which is kind of a more citizen-based movement, has really started alerting state and local governments to the need to become more open. And that may be changing more than the federal government.
And what specific steps do you think need to be taken for the situation to improve?
To do what they say they're going to do. I don't know. I think this idea of the presumption of the ownership of records as the public's is really a fundamental change that's got to happen. And the other thing that we find is that, I think reporting is probably the only other place that this is true. That what we found in freedom of information and in open records is that technology has raised the cost, not lowered it. And something is very wrong when you can't use technology to improve your efficiency. And what ends up happening now is that the records are in such bad shape that, for instance, if you want to get emails from an agency, they will print them out, take a marker, mark them through the private stuff, scan them back in, and then you'll get an image and you get to start all over. So something that was born digital creates a huge amount of work. There's got to be a better way than that.
And looking at the presidential candidates, is there any one of them that has a seeming commitment to open records?
I haven't really heard much about that. We can look at how they act, and clearly the President Obama would be the one that has expressed his most important, that is a big value of his. Newt Gingrich, when he was Speaker of the House, was a transparency advocate, whether he operated it that way or not. And we do know that Mitt Romney has resisted release of many of his emails from when he was governor, and has resisted opening up his own personal finances. So we don't know yet. I don't think he's spoken much about it, though, publicly.
And in your testimony, you recognize that at times the desire for open records can be at odds with the government's need to protect national security. So how do journalists and politicians mediate between those two goals?
The first thing is that the national security argument gets raised when it shouldn't be, and then you have a much more difficult time negotiating between those goals. I actually don't think there's as much tension from journalists that people think there are about keeping secrets. There are a couple of things that are still problematic. The classified review system is still not very efficient. But I think that the way that gets negotiated is to only raise it when it's truly there. And I think that there would be many fewer arguments if it was only raised when it was truly there. It is always easier to act in secrecy, and it's always going to be something that is going to make everything easier. But I think if WikiLeaks taught us something, what it taught us was that there's a lot of secrets that don't matter if they become made public, that there's no fundamental change in whatever happens because they were made public. So I think that the administration got the lesson that their systems weren't secure enough, and I would have hoped that the lesson would be that we don't have to keep so many secrets.
For that argument with WikiLeaks, do you think that there's kind of an argument to be made for that even if the information is not that newsworthy, there's still a public right to know?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so. And the question is, who gets to decide what's newsworthy? Is it the people that are doing the actions, or is it the people who are watching them, or is it the public that gets to decide what's newsworthy? And that's kind of not a very, leaving that decision to the government itself really turns journalism over to the government.
And with election season rapidly approaching, do you see kind of the relationship between politicians and journalists as changing a lot in this time?
No, not really. It's always pretty tense during elections. There's kind of two sets of reporters. There's the ones who are on the trail, who can become kind of part of the fabric of the campaign. They're as much a part of the campaign as the candidates. And then there's the ones who are usually back in the office and doing other stories, looking into their background and looking for stories that might be of interest to voters. I don't see that it's really changing this time, other than that things are unfolding much more quickly and much more unpredictably.
And something that we were just talking about in class earlier this morning is that journalists are expected to be very removed from the political scene in the sense that they can't attend rallies and they can't donate money to campaigns. Has that ever presented an issue for you in your career as a journalist, or has that ever frustrated you at all?
Not at all. It's the kind of thing that once you go into this line of work, at least when I went into it, it's an assumption that you are just ready to work with. I've never had a particular problem with it. But, I don't have a family, and so I think for people who maybe want to get more involved in their local school board or their local PTA, that could at some time create a conflict, I think that it might be harder for people like that. I also don't live in a politically active family, and so that could also make more problems for people.
Right. And we've gotten in a couple questions via email. Steve asks, does Professor Cohen think cable news has helped or hurt journalism and its mission to accurately inform the public?
Wow, I don't know.
Good question.
Good question. Probably both. It depends. We brush cable news with a broad brush. And I think when we think of cable news, we're thinking of some of the more contentious and opinionated talk shows, and we forget that there's an awful lot of actual news that goes on cable news. So my guess is that people are much better informed now than they were. Some of those shows, though, probably don't help much.
Right. Are cable news outlets more likely to succumb to the idea of infotainment in the sense of kind of trying to straddle the line between being entertaining and being informing, and thus kind of presenting sensationalized news?
I don't know. I think they just have more time to do it.
Right.
And so, I mean, the ratings game is going on for everybody, and I'm not that well versed in the broadcast industry and the cable industry, but I'm not sure that it's any different. I think reality TV is just as popular on broadcast as it is on cable.
We've gotten another question from Will by email, who asks, how have changes in investigative journalism affected coverage of the private sector and business in general?
That's a really interesting question. It's because the private sector is so much harder to report on. It is just that much more expensive to do it. And so I think we've probably not seen some of the best coverage, particularly the financial crisis, because it takes a lot of time and money just to understand it. Having said that, there have been some incredible stories on the private sector in the last few years. The ProPublica stories on hedge funds and and I think that Bloomberg itself, the first year it was eligible for a Pulitzer, was, I believe, a finalist in 2 Pulitzers. So there is a really aggressive set of business investigative reporting going on. I know Reuters is expanding its investigative team. So there may be more resources there than we think.
And in looking at the big picture of news coverage over the last year, are there any glaring errors that you see in coverage, either things that were covered too much or not covered enough?
Gosh, I'm always reluctant to say that without having tried it myself. You know, I can do the cliche thing that everybody feels, is that there's too much horse race journalism going on in the campaign, and that it tends to be much more about who's up and who's down. But it's awfully hard not to do that. So I don't think that I don't know that you can do anything about that. I'm also reluctant to say anything about campaign finance because I find those stories so unrewarding. But having said that, I'm still not sure I understand the full effect of super PACs and what's happening with that. What I think is really interesting is that probably the best coverage of campaign finance has come from Stephen Colbert, giving us all a tutorial on how they work. And so I don't know that I've seen a really good takeout on that lately, and since it is a campaign year. The other thing is I'm not sure I've seen, as a national campaign year, is really the strong evaluation of the president's record in terms of what he promised to do versus what he did and what he was able to accomplish, particularly administratively. And that's a class I was teaching at Duke the first couple of years I was here, about what a president can do on his own. And I'm not sure we've really looked at the regulatory record of the Obama administration compared to the promises or some of the other things that you should be able to judge an administration on.
We've gotten a question via email from Jack, who asks, does Professor Cohen miss the excitement of working at the Washington Post?
Absolutely. I do miss the newsroom quite a bit. And one of the things, my goal for this year is, now that we've gotten the Reporters Lab started and we're kind of on a way to getting more work done there, I'd really like to start working on stories again, because I really miss stories. Yeah.
And if you were still a journalist today, is there any one story that you particularly would want to cover at this point?
You know, I don't know. I think the best stories come from being on the beat, and the best stories come from being out and talking with people. So I'm not sure that I have been doing the work that would be required to get a really good story. There are a couple stories that I have in the back of my mind, though, that I would like to start pursuing a little bit.
And another question's come in from Ron, who asks, students used to be attracted to journalism by films like All the President's Men and other depictions of journalists fighting for truth and justice. Is that true of the students you teach today?
We don't have very many journalism students at Duke, so I think that the ones that I see, though, are just as motivated as they ever were. It's never been an easy field to get into, and it's never been an easy field to make a lot of money when you first get out of school. And so everybody who goes into it has always had to give up a lot to be there. And it really, you know, there have been some good movies about it lately. I think we watched in class the Page One movie about the New York Times, and I do think that people are just as interested now as they have been.
And a lot of journalism ethics, what I've gathered from our class discussions, is that they're very kind of intuitive or innate. So in that sense, just as you can't teach someone to be an ethical person, can you really teach them to be an ethical journalist?
Well, I think what you can do is prepare them for questions that they're going to have to, that are going to be raised over and over in their careers. That you know that at some point in your career, you're going to run into the problem of somebody trying to give you gifts, or that you're going to run into the problem of how independent are you, or you're going to run into a problem of what to do if you want to do an undercover story. So I think what you can do is prepare people for the kinds of decisions they're going to have to make, and not let them be a surprise, and let them see how other people have evolved. I don't think there is a right and wrong answer, and we've been discussing a lot about how they may be changing. It just the nature of news is changing, and maybe these are outdated mores that we're working with. But the idea that the problems are going to come up shouldn't be new to anybody.
And to that end, how has digital journalism changed the field of ethics? What kind of new quandaries have been presented as a result?
I think the big thing is what to do about the need for speed. We had the luxury in the past of having a whole day to think about a story, find out what's true, talk to a lot of people, look at some documents for a whole day before we had to actually publish something. Now, you pretty much have to publish your reactions as you see them and then move on. And the number of kind of, traps in that are enormous. So the idea that you can't hold on to anything anymore for even a few hours, no less a year while you're working on a project, is really difficult.
So we're running out of time here, but one last question. What advice do you have for journalists today to keep up with the changing face of media?
Just to have an open mind. That I think a lot of journalists still are very frightened of technology and kind of view it as somebody else's job. And the idea that kind of being proud of the idea that you hardly know how to use your content management system, kind of getting out of that mindset that you don't want to know anything new is really the easiest way to do it. And the other thing is to not be very, the same persistence you show in going after your stories, you should be going after in terms of learning how to do new things that you never could do before. And the idea that something is impossible today maybe should make us think that, well, maybe it is possible, and maybe you can get to that story.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we'd like to remind our viewers that a recording of this conversation will be available online at ondemand.duke.edu. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.